They say kings fell for beauty, but the truth is far colder. In the Tudor court, desire often began in silence, fed by whispered fears and the comfort of being heard. Behind every royal confession stood a woman history refused to name. Guiding a king without speaking a word, the deeper he leaned into her quiet, the more dangerous her presence became. Tonight, you will hear how a single listener could unravel a throne. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, I'll leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If a man like a Tudor king ever collapsed into desire, it usually began in the quiet moments he thought no one else noticed. The court believed seduction required bold gestures, perfumi, music, or the rustle of silk dresses. But the truth of Tudor life was far simpler and far more unsettling. A mistress did not need to whisper tempting words or reach out with soft hands. She only needed to sit still, let her breath fall into a steady rhythm, and create a silence wide enough for the king to step into. That silence did the rest. Stretching between them like a doorway, he did not realize he had already crossed. The women at court understood how powerful speech could be, but they also understood how dangerous it was. Words could be quoted, twisted, carried down corridors by servants who remembered everything. Silence, however, left no evidence. It promised safety to the one who kept it, and danger to the one who filled it. The king, surrounded by advisors, ambassadors, and clergy who expected constant declarations, rarely met anyone who offered him nothing but attention. In a world built on noise, quiet became its own kind of seduction. There is something almost bleak about watching how easily a ruler responded to stillness. He was a man accustomed to crowds bending, scraping, and forcing their way into his notice. Even his wife had duties to uphold, responsibilities that shaped every word she spoke. No one was free simply to listen to him. And when no one listens, a man starts to hunger for the smallest sign that his voice matters. A mistress who understood this only had to meet his eyes with unwavering calm, neither judging nor encouraging. She made room for him to unburden himself. And in that space, he began to believe she understood him. It was not affection. It was not passion. It was a vacancy. An emotional hollow carved out by court life, into which the king poured all the things he never said aloud. What looks like desire is often just loneliness wearing a different mask. The mistress, for all her beauty or grace, merely played the role that circumstances had designed for her. She did not need to confess longing or invent excuses to be near him. She let him make his own reasons, each one shaped by the fantasies he carried but never released in public. When people imagine Tudor seduction, they picture candlelit chambers and flirtation whispered behind tapestries. But the typical scene was far quieter. Picture a dim room after a long council meeting, the air heavy with smoke from torches. The king, still in his robes, shoulders tight from hours of argument. The mistress sits nearby, perhaps folding a piece of cloth, perhaps pretending to read. She does not rise, does not rush to greet him. She simply acknowledges his presence with the softest shift of attention. For a king who lived under constant scrutiny, the absence of expectation felt like relief. Most rulers did not know what to do with silence. The moment it opened, they filled it. They talked about the pressures of succession, the failures of their ministers, the sting of the latest tax dispute, or the weight of foreign threats. None of these were things they should have shared with a mistress. But boundaries in Tudor courts were fragile. Once the king realized she was not going to interrupt him, the words poured out faster. carrying more vulnerability than he should ever have revealed. A mistress did not need to speak at all during these encounters. Her stillness worked better than any calculated flirtation. Stillness absorbed pain. Stillness validated frustration. Stillness made him believe he was seen as a man rather than a monarch. If he mistook this for affection, the mistake was his alone. If he convinced himself she understood him better than anyone else, that too was a conclusion he built from his own longing. There is a dark irony in this dynamic. A king, surrounded by power, wealth, and fear, fell not to rebellion or treason, but to the quiet patience of a woman who rarely uttered a full sentence in his presence. Modern life teaches us to imagine manipulation as a sharp, aggressive tactic. Yet in the Tudor world, the most effective form of influence was passive. A woman could tilt the balance of a kingdom not by speaking, but by holding her tongue. Silence became a tool more potent than any threat. Even more unsettling is how normal this seemed to those who lived it. Courtiers walked past open doors where the king sat with a mistress, speaking freely while she listened with lowered eyes. No one questioned the imbalance of power. No one considered that silence could be a blade. The court accepted these scenes the way it accepted illness, hunger, and political cruelty as part of the fabric of existence. They preferred the illusion that desire was a simple matter of physical attraction, never realizing that the king was trapping himself each time he confided in her. If one were to stand at the edge of such a room, watching the king speak into the waiting quiet, the scene would look harmless. A man unburdening himself. A woman appears attentive. Nothing overt. Nothing dramatic. Yet the destruction began there, quietly, in a form no one could trace. By the time the king realized how much of himself he had poured into those silent moments, it was far too late. His dependence had already taken root. In truth, the mistress did not lure him. She merely allowed him to step across a threshold he had built with his own thoughts. The silence she offered acted like a mirror he did not know he was looking into, reflecting every weakness he had buried beneath the crown. He believed he was safe in that quiet, not knowing it was the most dangerous place he could stand. He left those early encounters unaware that he had already begun to lean toward her. The quiet surrounding them was shifting, heavy with something he had not yet named. There is always a moment when silence stops listening and starts pulling someone deeper. Listening in the Tudor court was never a simple virtue. It was a discipline shaped by expectation and sharpened by necessity. Women were taught to hold their silence, to lower their eyes, and to let the men around them speak without interruption. This expectation followed them into every chamber, every audience hall, every quiet corner where politics breathed beneath the surface. Yet for a mistress, listening had a different weight. It was no longer a sign of obedience, but a tool that shifted the balance between vulnerability and influence. Most courtiers underestimated the power of a woman who listened without haste. They saw her stillness as softness, her silence as passivity. But in a place where every statement traveled faster than any messenger, silence allowed a woman to remain untouched by accusations. Words could trap a person. Quiet kept her free. The mistress understood this better than anyone. She knew that speaking too boldly could mark her, and that asking too many questions could expose motives she preferred to hide. Instead, she shaped her presence into something the king found comforting, a steady listener whose quiet absorbed more than it revealed. Inside the palace, where men competed for the king's approval, and advisors filled rooms with overlapping voices, listening became a rare commodity. Everyone wanted to be heard. Few wanted to hear. It created a peculiar hunger in the king, a longing for a space where he did not need to defend his choices or justify his anger. The mistress stepped into this vacancy with deliberate simplicity. She offered him the illusion of unbroken attention, letting every word fall into the silence she maintained so carefully. There is a grim clarity in watching how such dynamics unfold. The king, for all his authority, leaned quickly into any form of comfort that did not demand a decision. A mistress who listened without judgment allowed him to feel, perhaps for the first time in days, like a man whose thoughts mattered. His confidence swelled in her presence, not because she praised him, but because she refrained from challenging him. The absence of tension became its own invitation, and the king mistook it for connection. This tactic, though subtle, held more danger than any act of seduction. By letting him speak, the mistress learned what troubled him, what angered him, and what softened him. She gathered information without appearing to seek it. In a court where knowledge was currency, listening turned into a quiet form of acquisition. Every confession he offered, without her asking, tied him closer to her. Every unguarded moment made the silence between them feel more intimate, even though she had done nothing more than remain present. A strange imbalance grew from this pattern. The more the king spoke, the more exposed he became. The more she listened, the more control she gained. It happened gradually, beneath the surface of daily routines, until neither of them could pinpoint the moment when their roles shifted. What began as a polite exchange became a private ritual, repeated so often that it no longer required effort. In a court full of ambition, this might have been expected, but the quiet nature of it made the transformation almost sinister. What remains unsettling is how natural this seemed to everyone involved. Servants passing through hallways saw nothing unusual in a king speaking freely to a silent woman. Advisors dismissed her presence as harmless, failing to consider how a single listener could offer him a refuge no government could compete with. In the silence, she preserved. The king found relief. In the silence, she shaped. She found an opening. Listening, in the Tudor world, was never neutral. It was a facade of gentleness that concealed the beginnings of deeper entanglement. The mistress knew this. The king did not. And that difference, subtle as it appeared, marked the path he would eventually walk without realizing how little of it he chose himself. He believed her quiet attention offered safety, unaware of how deeply she had begun to settle into his thoughts. Somewhere in the calm between conversations, the balance of their roles started to tilt. There is a moment ahead when his own words will bind him more tightly than any vow he has ever spoken. The Tudor king lived in a world that demanded strength at every turn, a world that allowed no fractures in the image he presented. His marriage, arranged through political necessity, offered stability but not intimacy. A queen was expected to represent the kingdom, to anchor alliances, and to maintain decorum even in private chambers. She could not be a space for weakness. Every word between them was shaped by duty, wrapped in expectation, and measured for its political weight. In such an environment, the king found himself surrounded by people, yet starved of someone who would let him unravel without consequence. Court life worsened this hunger. Advisors lingered around him like shadows, waiting for any hesitation to exploit or any moment of vulnerability to interpret as instability. The council chamber was a battlefield of opinions disguised as service. Even in the quiet moments before dawn, when the torches burned low and the corridors felt empty, the king walked with the awareness that every step carried echoes someone might hear. Power left no room for softness. Every morning, he put on strength like armor, and every night, he kept it on because removing it felt far too dangerous. This constant vigilance carved hollows inside him. He spoke boldly in public because silence would make him appear uncertain. He spoke carefully at court because too much candor could be used against him. Yet when the doors finally closed and the expectations dropped away, the absence of someone who truly listened became heavier. A man could rule a kingdom and still be left with no place to set down the weight of his own thoughts. That is where a mistress entered. Not as a lover at first, not as a conspirator, but as the only person who allowed him to speak without reshaping his words for political survival. Unlike the queen, a mistress did not represent diplomacy. Unlike the council, she did not defend positions or debate strategies. She had no official duty to question him, correct him, or uphold the demands of governance. Her role was unrecorded, undefined, and therefore strangely free. When he spoke, she did not evaluate the consequences of what he said. She simply allowed the words to exist. In a world built on scrutiny, that was a rare and disarming relief. It is unsettling to realize how quickly a king could slip into this comfort. A ruler accustomed to command found solace in someone who expected nothing from him. Her silence became a refuge. Her presence softened the edges of his public life. He found himself returning to her not because of passion, but because she allowed him to feel human in a way no one else dared. The court saw her as an ornament, a distraction, a pleasant indulgence. They did not see how deeply the king relied on the spaces she offered him, spaces where he did not have to perform. The mistress became the keeper of words he never intended to release. His doubts about succession, his displeasure with council decisions, his private frustrations with foreign threats, all these slipped out in conversations that were never meant to carry weight. But to a man trapped by expectations, speaking freely felt like breathing freely. He mistook this relief for intimacy, and intimacy for something deeper. The more he confided, the more irreplaceable she appeared. Not because she solved anything, but because she absorbed what no one else would. There is a quiet tragedy in watching how desperately a king sought such release. His crown gave him authority, but it also isolated him. His advisors respected him, but they also feared him. His subjects admired him, but they never saw him. The queen shared his life, but not his private burdens. And so, in the stillness of hidden rooms, he turned to the only person who let him unravel without consequence. In the gentleness of her listening, he found a relief mistaken for loyalty. Over time, this dynamic grew into something more fragile than affection. It became a dependence. Each confession he offered made returning to her easier. Each moment of vulnerability made the connection feel deeper than it was. He believed he was understood. She understood he needed to believe that. And the imbalance that followed was something he never recognized until the consequences reached beyond the walls of intimacy and into the corridors of power. A king who could not show weakness in public needed someone to witness it in private. A mistress who listened became that witness. And in the Tudor world, witnessing a king's weakness was more dangerous and more powerful than any rumor whispered through the court. He left each conversation lighter, unaware of how much of himself he had abandoned along the way. The room between them had begun to shift, carrying a quiet risk neither spoke of aloud. A subtle turn awaits when his need for her begins to press against the edges of his own restraint. Life inside the Tudor court was dense with ceremony. A world where every gesture carried meaning and every silence carried expectation. The king moved through this world as its central figure, yet strangely untouched by genuine connection. Ritual shaped every hour, from the moment he woke to the moment his chamber doors finally closed. People bowed, spoke carefully, and watched his reactions with the kind of fear that smothered authenticity. Even in rooms full of attendants, the king lived in a space that felt curiously hollow. Layers of protocol surrounded him, leaving little room for ordinary human warmth. The queen, bound by her role, could not step outside the boundaries set for her. Her presence represented lineage, diplomacy, and the stability of the crown. She was expected to maintain composure regardless of her feelings. Her conversations with the king were measured and appropriate, never crossing into the kind of intimacy that exposed weakness. In such a marriage, affection was secondary to responsibility. Their public lives shaped their private interactions until both became indistinguishable. The king could speak to her as a ruler, but rarely as a man. Courtiers deepened this isolation. They watched him constantly, reading every shift in his expression for political advantage. Their compliments were calculated, their loyalty conditional, and their concern more strategic than sincere. Even the smallest remark he made travelled outward through the palace like water seeping into stone. Every opinion might become a rumour. Every frustration might be misinterpreted as instability. The king learned early that his words had consequences, and so he disciplined himself to speak with caution. Over time, this caution hardened into emotional distance. Such distance created a quiet ache that no ritual could soften. The king's days were filled with sound. Advisors speaking, scribes reading petitions, foreign envoys pushing agendas. But few of these voices acknowledged his inner life. He began to sense that no one truly listened to him as a person. Even in crowded halls, he felt separate, as though an invisible barrier prevented anyone from crossing into the territory of his private thoughts. Loneliness settled into the rhythms of his daily existence, disguised beneath the weight of authority. This emotional emptiness became a kind of vacancy, a silent corridor within him that no official companion could enter. It softened him in ways the court did not anticipate. It made him more receptive to small gestures, to the faintest signs of attention, to moments that felt unburdened by duty. A woman who simply acknowledged his presence without calculation felt unexpectedly rare. A woman who listened without offering advice felt rarer still. The mistress did not need to compete with queens or ministers. She merely stepped into the place the court had left untouched. The king found himself drawn toward spaces where the formalities of power thinned. He lingered in private chambers longer than necessary, delaying the return to voices demanding decisions. He walked slowly through quiet galleries, seeking moments where he could exist without evaluation. These small acts revealed how deeply the emotional void had settled. The court mistook his wandering for contemplation. They did not see the hunger beneath it. When he encountered the mistress in such settings, her presence felt different from the others. She did not perform the same elaborate rituals. Her silence was free of expectation. Her movements lacked the stiffness of those trained to mirror etiquette. She existed in the room as a human being first, not as a symbol of political obligation. In that difference, the king discovered a kind of relief he had not known he needed. Something is unsettling about how quickly this relief transformed into attachment. He spoke to her more often, allowing himself to drift into topics he would never share with counselors or foreign envoys. Their conversations were simple, almost mundane, yet the simplicity became precious to him. For a man constrained by ceremony, ordinary interaction felt like escape. The court continued, unchanged around him, unaware of the quiet shift taking place in these private pockets of time. The mistress did not fill the king's emotional void through passion or boldness. She filled it by existing in a space untouched by ritual. She became the first person in years to witness his thoughts without tying them to political consequence. The void inside him deepened, not because she created it, but because she illuminated how empty it had always been. And once he recognized the comfort she offered, the court's rigid structure felt more suffocating than ever. Such dynamics rarely ended cleanly. The more he returned to her, the more the void shaped his desires, guiding him toward places he would not have entered alone. The palace was full of people, yet no one else stepped into the absence carved by duty. It left him exposed, softened, and vulnerable to someone who had never asked for power, but inevitably received it. He moved through the palace, unaware that his own emptiness had begun to pull him toward her. Small moments of ease were gathering weight, binding him more tightly than he intended. Some shifts unfold so quietly that no one recognizes the danger until it is already settling into place. Attention in the Tudor court carried a weight few recognized. Most people looked at the king with calculation, waiting for cues to shift their loyalties or advance their interests. His words were treated as instructions, not sentiments. His presence was a signal to act, not an invitation to understand. In such an atmosphere, the act of simply paying attention, genuine, unbroken attention, became its own quiet rarity. The mistress, perhaps more than anyone else, understood how to offer it without appearing deliberate. Her gaze did not dart around the room, searching for other courtiers or measuring reactions. It stayed with him, steady and calm, as though nothing beyond his voice mattered. This was not the wide-eyed admiration of someone seeking favor, nor the tense focus of an advisor bracing for political consequences. It was a listening anchored in stillness. The king, accustomed to eyes that flickered with ambition, found her undivided attention disarming. It softened him before he realized it was happening. Silence, when combined with such focus, created an atmosphere he rarely encountered. She did not interrupt him, did not offer corrections, did not force the conversation in a new direction. She allowed his thoughts to appear without shaping them. The absence of judgment made his words feel strangely important. A man who lived under relentless public scrutiny came to believe that she heard him as no one else ever had. That belief alone began to alter the nature of their interactions. Something is unsettling about how modest gestures can shift the balance of intimacy. She did not speak in riddles or deploy elaborate charms. She did not need to lean forward in theatrical sympathy. The quiet was enough. The longer she remained attentive, the more he associated her presence with relief. The connection forming between them was not built on passion or intrigue, but on the illusion that his voice found a home in her silence. Her attention wrapped itself around his frustrations, his doubts, and the daily storms of governance. The court dismissed her as unimportant, a marginal figure who could be ignored. Yet she witnessed emotions the council never saw. Each moment of patience allowed him to wander deeper into his own mind, expressing thoughts that had been buried beneath the weight of the crown. She learned more from watching him than he realized he was giving away. He mistook this quiet observation for closeness. She saw it for what it was: access. What made this dynamic even more potent was how effortless it seemed. He spoke, and she listened. He complained, and she received the words without resistance. He vented his anger, and she let the silence hold it. The lack of friction became intoxicating. A woman who said nothing gained influence over a man who commanded armies. The contradiction was almost darkly comedic, but it revealed something fundamental about the fragility of power. Those who speak loudly often depend on those who listen quietly. The king did not question why she listened so well. He assumed it came from affection or admiration, the way a thirsty man assumes every cup of water is offered with kindness. He did not consider that her attention might be strategic. The court expected women to be quiet, so her silence carried no suspicion. Behind that mask, however, she could observe his weaknesses and map the contours of his private turmoil. She collected information without asking for it, simply by letting him talk. Her stillness served as an anchor. When he looked at her, he did not see a potential threat. He saw ease, a sense of grounding that felt absent in the rest of his life. Ministers challenged him. Ambassadors pressured him. Even the queen held her own expectations. The mistress alone created a space where the king did not feel the need to defend himself. For a man carrying the burden of a turbulent monarchy, that comfort became dangerous. People at court noticed his behavior changing before he did. He stayed longer in rooms where she lingered. His tone softened when he spoke near her. His decisions seemed influenced by a calmness that arose only after their meetings. The attention she gave him began to shape not only his moods, but his actions. What began as a private reprieve slowly extended into the public sphere. A gaze held for too long can do more than stir desire. It can redirect power. It is chilling to consider how little she needed to do. She did not push him, did not manipulate him with elaborate schemes. She simply listened in a world where no one else cared to. The king built the rest of the illusion himself. His longing grew, not from her words, but from the silence she preserved so carefully. What he mistook for understanding was simply the reflection of his own desire to be understood. In time, He came to rely on her attention, the way a weary traveller relies on a lamp at dusk. He sought it without realizing how deeply he drifted. He returned again and again, not because she demanded it, but because her silence created a world where his thoughts did not feel dangerous. It was a fragile comfort, but he clung to it all the same. He left their conversations believing she saw him more clearly than anyone in his life. Patterns of closeness were beginning to settle around them, quiet but unmistakable. Moments ahead will reveal how attention alone can draw a king further than intent ever could. Encouraging the king to speak required no elaborate skill, only a refined sense of timing. The mistress understood that conversations in the Tudor court were rarely about meaning. They were about positioning. Ministers spoke to influence him. Ambassadors spoke to pressure him. Courtiers spoke to impress him. Every word aimed for an outcome. The king lived inside a constant barrage of intention, leaving him guarded even in private chambers. For him to speak freely, he needed someone who stripped expectation from the moment. The mistress learned to become that presence with gestures so subtle they disappeared into the dim air. She nodded at the right moments. Not eagerly, not dismissively, but with a quiet assurance that told him she was following, not judging. Her nods were gentle cues, inviting him to continue without signaling agreement. Most people around the king nodded to flatter him, hoping to secure their own position. Her nods, by contrast, offered no persuasion. They simply encouraged movement. In a world filled with performances, this minimal affirmation felt strangely disarming. It allowed his thoughts to drift outward, carrying fragments he rarely shared. When the conversation stalled, she used open questions that carried no direction. She asked in a way that suggested curiosity rather than strategy, leaving the king free to choose how deeply he wished to reveal himself. The absence of guidance gave him a sense of control he did not experience elsewhere. The council chamber was full of pointed questions designed to corner him into decisions. Her questions expanded the space instead of narrowing it. He stepped into that space willingly, unaware of how it widened the path he walked toward vulnerability. These questions did not challenge him. They did not demand explanations or force him to defend his reasoning. They simply allowed the subject to breathe. A man accustomed to debates found the lack of resistance comforting. He interpreted her openness as trust, unaware that it allowed him to excavate his own thoughts without interruption. She did not coax or pry. She let him wander. And in that wandering, he revealed more than he ever intended. There is an unsettling clarity in watching someone unravel without noticing it. The king believed he was sharing just enough, that he controlled the conversation. He did not realize that each detail he offered gave her a map of his emotional landscape. His frustrations, ambitions, private fears, and memories spilled forward in pieces. She collected them quietly, without prompting, and her expression was deliberately calm. To the king, this felt like intimacy. To her, it was information. Her restraint made him speak more. She did not attempt to fill silences. She did not rush to offer comfort. Instead, she allowed the quiet to stretch, creating small pressures that encouraged him to continue. Most people fear silence, especially those who speak from positions of authority. Silence feels like judgment or uncertainty, but the mistress held it with the steadiness of someone who understood its usefulness. In the vacuum she created, he filled the space naturally, as though compelled by his own momentum. Her listening became a kind of mirror, reflecting nothing, allowing him to project everything. This made him feel understood, even when she said almost nothing. He mistook his own words for evidence of connection. The more he spoke, the more convinced he became that she was the one person who truly grasped him. What he failed to see was that she did not need to grasp him. She only needed him to believe she did. The court noticed subtle changes. His conversations with advisors grew shorter. His patience in council meetings thinned. Decisions he once debated fiercely now seemed tiresome. He saved his longer thoughts for private chambers, where he paced slowly and spoke freely, while the mistress listened with her hands folded, her gaze steady. The shift was quiet but unmistakable. He spoke to her in paragraphs, to everyone else in fragments. Her influence was not loud. It did not show itself in dramatic scenes or bold demands. It was woven into the cadence of their conversations, into the way he lingered before leaving the room, into the ease with which he confided personal matters. His dependence grew with each unburdened thought. She understood that she did not need to lead him. She only needed to let him move where his mind already leaned. The king believed he was choosing to open himself. He did not realize how much the environment shaped that choice. A nod here, a quiet question there. Silence stretched just long enough to draw out another confession. Influence disguised itself as permission. A mistress who seemed passive held more sway than those who demanded his attention outright. She mastered the art of guiding without acting, of prompting without appearing to do so. By letting him dive deeper into his own thoughts, she offered a kind of intimacy that asked for nothing, yet gained everything. He felt lighter after their conversations, unaware that each moment carved a new path toward dependence. She walked this path with him, though not at the same depth. Her steps were deliberate. His were unguarded. He left those meetings unaware of how easily her quiet had shaped the direction of his thoughts. Small gestures had begun to loop around him, pulling him further with deceptive gentleness. Somewhere ahead, the ease he found in her presence will begin to tighten its hold in ways he cannot foresee. The first signs of attachment rarely appeared dramatic. They settled quietly into the spaces between conversations, forming themselves out of patterns that seemed harmless at the beginning. The king spoke of burdens no one else heard, frustrations he could not voice in council, and disappointments he refused to share with the queen. These confessions came in fragments at first, scattered between remarks about the day's decisions or the tensions of court. But the mistress noticed how gradually those fragments grew into complete thoughts, and complete thoughts grew into something heavier. He complained about the pressures of ruling, about ministers who argued endlessly, about conflicts he had to resolve before they reached the public. He revealed irritations he normally buried beneath the performance of authority. The weight of the crown pressed harder behind closed doors, carving lines into his face that no advisor dared acknowledge. When he spoke of these things, his voice lost the sharpness of command. It lowered, softened, revealing the fatigue behind each word. The mistress received these confessions in the same quiet manner she used for everything else. No judgment, to no interruption, no hint that his vulnerability could become a liability. The difference between her and everyone else in his life became clearer with each passing day. The council heard his decisions, not his doubts. Foreign envoys heard his posture, not his worries. The queen heard his duty, not his despair. But the mistress heard everything he tried to hide. She witnessed the cracks beneath the crown, the moments when the king, stripped of ceremony, sounded like a man uncertain of his choices. He did not recognize how rare this admission was, nor did he realize how deeply he had begun to rely on the space she offered him. Her silence became the container for emotions he avoided in public. He found relief in articulating frustrations no one else could be trusted to hear. That relief grew addictive. A man surrounded by noise sought out the one place where his voice did not bounce back at him with obligation. His complaints turned into confessions, and his confessions turned into something more intimate than he intended. The mistress did not comfort him directly, but her attentive stillness created the illusion of safety. In that illusion, he felt understood. It is unsettling to see how easily such emotional exchanges transform into attachment. He began returning to her with increasing urgency, as though each day deposited new burdens he needed to unload. What he perceived as an honest conversation was, in truth, the beginning of dependence. The more he revealed, the more he needed her presence to make sense of his internal disarray. The court noticed his mood lifting after these meetings, but they attributed it to rest or temporary clarity. They did not see the emerging imbalance. The mistress, meanwhile, understood the shift with quiet precision. She recognized that he spoke to her differently now, with a tone that lingered between vulnerability and expectation. She knew that becoming the sole keeper of his private thoughts granted her a position no title could secure. Exclusivity grew slowly, fed by the knowledge that she heard what no one else did. She did not push for this role. She simply allowed it to form, knowing that the king filled the silence with whatever he needed most. Over time, the king believed she was the only one who truly saw him. He mistook her neutrality for empathy, her patience for loyalty, her quiet for emotional depth. His words wrapped around the idea of her, shaping a connection he built more than she did. He grew protective of the time they shared, treating it as something sacred and separate from the court. Each complaint he voiced deepened the sense of closeness he imagined. He did not recognize that he had woven the illusion himself. What made this transformation so powerful was its subtlety. No dramatic gestures marked its arrival. No declarations were made. The shift lived in the rhythm of their conversations, in how he paused when she entered a room, in the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. Attachment disguised itself as relief. Dependency disguised itself as trust. And in the quiet, these disguises settled into place until they felt natural. A king rarely admitted loneliness, even to himself. But through his complaints, he revealed how fragile he had become. With each confession, the mistress gained a clearer view of the emotional void that shaped him. She did not fill that void, she simply witnessed it. Yet witnessing alone was enough to bind him to her, because he believed that shared pain meant shared closeness. It was a dangerous assumption, but one he continued to make with increasing certainty. He walked away from their conversations unaware that each confession had tightened the thread between them. The comfort he found in her presence was beginning to harden into something more possessive. Some truths, once spoken, start building attachments he will not be able to loosen. Listening without correction carried a unique power in the Tudor court. The king lived in a world where every opinion he voiced triggered an immediate response. Advisors countered him. Diplomats challenged him. And even loyal ministers quietly reshaped his words to suit political agendas. Debates surrounded him like weather, constant and unavoidable. So when the mistress chose not to challenge him, not to redirect him, not to correct even the smallest mistake, the relief he felt slipped easily into something deeper. What seemed like courtesy was, in truth, a remarkably effective strategy. She understood that contradiction had no place in their private conversations. Correcting him would remind him of council chambers, where arguments formed the backbone of governance. Challenging him would tie their time together to the same tensions that defined his public life. The mistress instead offered him something he rarely received, the feeling of being unquestionably right. Her silence was not agreement, but the king interpreted it as such. In that interpretation, she gained influence without lifting a finger. Every leader, especially one surrounded by ambition, longs for moments where their thoughts remain undisturbed. The king was no exception. He had grown accustomed to resistance masked as counsel. Even compliments carried the weight of ulterior motives. But when he spoke to her, his words were met with quiet acceptance. She did not push back when his temper flared. She did not question his judgments. She did not soften his frustrations with reason. Instead, she allowed him to settle into the comfort of his own certainty. There is an unsettling truth in how quickly certainty becomes addictive. The king began to associate his own correctness with her presence. He felt more confident when he spoke to her, more assured in his opinions, more validated in his impulses. This validation, though unspoken, began to shape his dependence. The court saw him entering her chambers with weary tension and leaving with renewed conviction. They assumed she flattered him. They did not realize she did nothing but refrain from resistance. Avoiding contradiction did not make her passive. It made her observant. She knew that a man of great power often reveals more when he is not questioned. With each unchallenged opinion, he revealed beliefs he would never share in council debates. With each unchecked frustration, he exposed weak points in his authority. She learned his insecurities by listening to the places where he insisted he was strong. She learned his fears by watching the moments when his voice tightened. Her silence did not protect him. It illuminated him. He mistook this illumination for intimacy. He believed she understood him, supported him, and aligned herself with his judgments. In reality, she simply allowed him to feel unthreatened, a state so rare for him that he clung to it instinctively. This comfort sowed the first seeds of dependence, though neither could articulate it. A man who felt constantly defended in public now felt effortlessly supported in private. The difference was profound enough that he adjusted the rhythm of his days to seek it. The court, unaware of the nuance, whispered its own theories. Some thought she manipulated him through charm. Others believed she had discovered secrets strong enough to bind him. Neither theory was correct. Her power came not from action, but from restraint. Those who attacked the king's ideas pushed him toward defensiveness. She, by withholding criticism, pulled him inward. He leaned into her, quiet as though it were stability. Not realizing it was simply the absence of opposition, a strange cycle formed, the less she questioned him. The more he talked, the more he talked. The more exposed he became, the more exposed he became. The more he relied on her silence to hold those vulnerabilities. She understood this cycle well. She did not accelerate it. She simply let it happen. Soft influence rarely requires pushing. It requires creating a space where the other person moves on their own. In time, the king began making decisions with a confidence that surprised his council. He no longer sought their opinions with the same urgency. He trusted his own instincts more, believing their clarity emerged from his private conversations. This shift did not stem from wisdom, but from the illusion of correctness nurtured in the mistress's presence. His reliance on her silence fed his growing dependence on her company. Her choice not to contradict him became one of the most effective ways to tighten the quiet bond between them. What makes this dynamic darkly compelling is how invisible it remained to those outside the room. The king believed he was in control. The mistress appeared merely attentive. Yet each unchallenged word carried them both deeper into a relationship neither fully acknowledged. It was not passion or manipulation that shaped it, but the quiet, deliberate choice to withhold disagreement. Silence, once again, became the most potent instrument in the room. He walked away from their conversations convinced that his judgments held new clarity, unaware of how much that certainty depended on her quiet. The ease she gave him was beginning to settle into something weighted, something neither of them named aloud. In the moments ahead, illusion will blur even further with trust, tightening the path he already walks. Understanding in the Tudor court was a rare commodity, far rarer than loyalty or obedience. The king moved through his days surrounded by people whose devotion was tangled with ambition, each one offering service shaped by their own desires. No one approached him without a purpose. No one listened without calculation. Under such conditions, the simple feeling of being understood carried a dangerous sweetness. It was this sweetness, not beauty, not physical closeness, that softened him toward the mistress long before he realized what had happened. She did not claim to understand him. That would have shattered the illusion. Instead, she allowed him to believe it on his own, shaping her stillness into a vessel that absorbed every frustration, every confession, every unspoken fear. Her silence became the mirror he looked into, and in that reflection he saw only what he longed to see, acceptance without judgment. For a man hemmed in by power, that feeling slipped easily into something like longing. The king began to speak of things he had never voiced aloud. Not desires, but doubts. He admitted irritations he hid from the court, the strains of diplomacy, and the weight of being perceived as infallible. She offered no commentary, only the quiet presence that made his disclosures feel safe. And because safety was so rare in his world, he mistook it for something more intimate. What he interpreted as emotional closeness was simply the relief of unburdening himself in a room where his words did not echo back in the form of consequences. It is unsettling how quickly a person can confuse being heard with being cherished. The king, accustomed to resistance masked as counsel, experienced her stillness as empathy. Her attentive gaze felt like affection. Her neutrality felt like understanding. In reality, she revealed nothing. She maintained her careful silence, while he filled the space between them with meaning that belonged entirely to him. Desire began to root itself in the places where he projected his own needs onto her. This shift did not come with dramatic gestures. It crept in through pauses, through the way he lingered before leaving her chambers, through the softening of his voice when he addressed her. He started measuring the comfort of his day by the time he spent in her presence. The council meetings felt heavier. The rituals of court felt more suffocating. The queen's formal kindness offered no relief. Only with the mistress did he experience the illusion of being truly seen. What made the dynamic even more intricate was the depth of his misinterpretation. He believed she listened because she cared. He believed she understood because she stayed quiet. He believed the calm she offered indicated closeness. In truth, she simply held the space that allowed his emotional exhaustion to surface. Her restraint became the foundation on which he built an imagined bond. The more he believed she felt for him, the more intensely he felt for her. Desire, born of misunderstanding, is fragile but fiercely consuming. The king's longing did not emerge from physical attraction alone. It grew from the sense that she offered something the entire kingdom denied him. He leaned into this illusion with growing confidence, allowing it to guide his steps more boldly. He lingered too long in her presence, returned too quickly after meetings, and watched her with a softness that startled even himself. The lines separating gratitude, dependence, and desire blurred until they became indistinguishable. The mistress, for her part, did not encourage nor discourage this shift. She recognized it for what it was, the natural progression of a man slowly mistaking emotional vulnerability for intimacy. She let it unfold at its own pace, knowing that intervening would draw attention. Her silence protected her, even as it fueled his attachment. She did not seek to control him. She simply understood the risk and the opportunity embedded within his confusion. The court, predictably, misunderstood the nature of their connection. Whispers framed it as seduction, as though desire were always born from physical temptation. They did not notice the far more potent force at play, the king's hunger to feel understood. They failed to see how deprivation shaped him, how deeply he needed a place where his authority did not overshadow his humanity. Physical beauty could attract him, but emotional illusion captured him. In time, the king's longing became inseparable from the solace he found in her presence. He no longer distinguished between the person she was and the refuge she provided. He returned to her as though drawn by gravity, unaware that he had created the force himself. The confusion between being heard and being loved carved the path he walked, steady and unbroken. He carried this sense of closeness as though it were truth, not realizing it was shaped entirely by his own longing. Moments of ease were turning into expectations, settling into the rhythm of his days with quiet certainty. Somewhere ahead, craving will begin to sharpen into dependence he will struggle to name. Body language in the Tudor court carried meanings far more intricate than words. A single gesture could shift the atmosphere of a room, revealing intentions no one dared speak aloud. The king, accustomed to courtiers who bowed too deeply or stood too rigidly, learned to read these signals with instinctive caution. People approached him with stiffness, with fear, with the careful restraint of those who understood their entire future depended on his favor. Yet the mistress stood apart from this rigid choreography. Her movements lacked the tension that surrounded him everywhere else. She approached, listening not through speech, but through the quiet discipline of her body. She leaned toward him, just enough to signal attention, but never far enough to seem eager. The angle was subtle, barely perceptible, yet its effect was profound. A slight inclination suggested interest, without pressure. Presence without intrusion. The king felt the difference immediately. Those who sought influence leaned too close. Those who feared him leaned away. She occupied a rare position between the two, close enough to make him feel acknowledged, distant enough to let him feel unthreatened. This balance soothed him more effectively than any spoken reassurance. Her hands amplified the stillness she maintained. They rested lightly in her lap or folded neatly at her side, never fidgeting, never gesturing for attention. Hands often betrayed anxiety or impatience, but hers revealed nothing. She did not clasp them tightly or press them together. Their calm reinforced the impression that she was prepared to receive his thoughts without demanding anything in return. That sense of readiness made the king more willing to speak. He saw no tension in her posture, no hints of resistance. He interpreted this as emotional openness, unaware of how carefully she curated the effect. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning. When he spoke, she lifted her gaze just slightly, not dramatically, not abruptly. The movement was gentle, as though she were adjusting her attention rather than reacting to his authority. This subtle raising of the eyes created a continuous thread of connection, reminding him that his words did not vanish into the room, but landed somewhere specific. A man surrounded by people who treated his speech as an obligation began to crave this illusion of genuine reception. In truth, her gestures were neither accidental nor impulsive. They formed a quiet vocabulary that communicated attentiveness without revealing motivation. She knew when to tilt her head by a fraction, when to let her breath slow, when to soften her expression, but only slightly, never enough to appear emotionally entangled. Each movement signaled that she remained present, even when she spoke no words. And because he found no contradiction in her demeanour, the king sensed no need to guard himself. Something is unsettling about the power of such subtlety. The ease he felt in her presence grew not from overt affection but from the absence of friction. Her gestures did not challenge him, did not correct him, did not redirect him. They encouraged him to continue. They turned the space between them into something resembling privacy in a palace that allowed none. He mistook these signals for understanding, for sympathy, for emotional alignment. But the meaning he assigned to her movements belonged entirely to him. Over time, he began to rely on these small cues more than he realized. When her posture leaned slightly forward, he interpreted it as genuine engagement. When her hands remained still, he believed she was absorbing his thoughts. When she held his gaze for a breath longer than necessary, he saw it as affirmation. These interpretations, rooted in his own emotional hunger, built a connection where her intent remained largely unreadable. She offered no promises, yet he believed she had already given herself. This body language intimacy did not exist in his relationships with others. Advisors watched him with caution. Courtiers observed him with calculation. Even the queen maintained a posture shaped by duty, not emotion. Only the mistress existed in the quiet middle ground where nothing felt forced. Her posture told him he was neither a symbol nor an obligation. For a king starved of ordinary intimacy, this illusion became irresistible. As the months passed, these gestures wove themselves into the rhythm of their interactions. He found comfort in their predictability, in the sense that she remained steady even when the burdens of the kingdom pressed against him. He leaned on her attentiveness the way he leaned on his throne, but with far less awareness of the danger. What looked calm was, in truth, the subtle architecture of influence. She placed no demands on him, yet each gesture invited him deeper into the quiet he mistook for connection. Her body language became a silent conversation he depended on. The king never questioned how easily he surrendered his thoughts in her presence. He believed her gestures reflected something about her feelings. He did not realize they reflected something about his needs. He left each meeting convinced that her quiet movements revealed a closeness he could trust. Small gestures were beginning to shape his sense of safety, weaving themselves into his expectations. Signals he misreads as affection will soon pull him further into the attachment he already carries. Moments of listening mattered as much as the act itself. The mistress understood that the king's mind was not equally open throughout the day. His composure shifted with the weight of decisions, the heat of conflict, and the exhaustion that settled after hours of presenting himself as an unshakable ruler. She learned to recognize these changes, not through dramatic signs, but through the small fatigue that crept into his shoulders, the tension that settled in his jaw, the way his steps lost their precision when he walked away from council chambers. It was in these specific windows that her silence held the most influence. After tense meetings, the king often left with the residue of arguments still clinging to him. Advisors sharpened their words under the guise of duty. Diplomats veiled warnings in polite formality. He returned carrying contradictions, doubts, and frustrations. During these moments, he was not looking for reason. He was looking for release. The mistress offered exactly that. She did not question the decisions debated in council. She did not reference the disagreements he wrestled with. She simply received him with the calm that no one else dared show. In these moments, he felt a rare unraveling, as though the tightness of leadership loosened just enough for him to breathe. His vulnerability deepened when exhaustion took hold. The late hours, the endless ceremonies, the pressure to remain composed. They all chipped away at his resolve. Fatigue softened the edges of his authority, revealing a weariness he never acknowledged aloud. When he arrived in her presence in this state, the mistress did not rush to speak. She waited, letting silence draw his thoughts out. A tired man speaks more freely, not because he trusts more deeply, but because he no longer has the strength to guard himself. His weariness became the doorway through which his inner turmoil stepped forward. Confusion created another window. Whenever the king felt uncertain about an ally, a decision, or even a prophecy whispered by the superstitious, his voice shifted. Doubt introduced hesitation. He tried to hide from everyone but could not conceal from her. The mistress recognized the tremor in his tone, the slight break in rhythm when he attempted to appear confident. In those moments, she positioned herself not as reassurance, but as a space where his uncertainty could live without consequence. He filled that space quickly, mistaking her quiet availability for understanding. What made these moments powerful was not her presence alone, but her timing. She did not seek him when he felt strong or decisive. She stepped forward only when the sharpness of his authority blunted, when the walls he held around himself weakened just enough. She allowed him to arrive at her, never appearing to demand attention. The timing created the illusion that she existed exactly when he needed her. Not before, not after. The consistency of this pattern carved a path he began to follow instinctively. A king who felt exhausted gravitated toward the one place where he could discard his armor. A king who felt uncertain drifted toward the one person who did not press him for clarity. A king who felt overwhelmed sought the quiet, where no one attempted to shape his decisions. What she offered him was not guidance, but the sensation of being understood at the exact moments he felt most exposed. It was not affection, nor seduction, but a strategic availability that felt like comfort. Over time, these carefully chosen moments formed a sequence that shaped his emotional dependence. He began to believe she sensed his feelings intuitively, as though connected to him by some unspoken bond. He did not realize she had simply learned the rhythms of his fatigue and the cadence of his frustration. He mistook observation for empathy, timing for intimacy, and once he believed this connection existed, he sought it out with growing urgency. His steps toward her chambers came earlier after difficult meetings. His visits lasted longer on days when negotiation drained him. His voice softened faster when he felt lost. What began as occasional relief became a ritual. One he created. One she never needed to request. He shaped the routine himself, unaware of how thoroughly the timing of her silence guided him. What makes this progression quietly haunting is how natural it looked from the outside. No one saw manipulation. No one suspected intention. They saw only a king visiting a woman who calmed him. The truth was far more fragile. She listened precisely when his defenses cracked. And each time he returned, those cracks widened just a little more. He left these encounters feeling steadier than before, unaware that his calm depended on the hours when he was weakest. The pattern of turning to her was beginning to harden into a habit, binding him more firmly to her quiet presence. Soon, the things he cannot say in council will no longer belong to the king alone. They will belong to the space she provides. There were truths the king could never speak in the presence of his court. Truths that clung to him like shadows he carried from chamber to chamber. Power demanded certainty, and certainty allowed no room for fear, suspicion, or doubt. Yet these were the very things that pressed closest to him, tightening their grip in the moments between decisions. The court saw a sovereign wrapped in ceremony, unwavering and absolute. Only the mistress witnessed the man behind that rigid silhouette, the one burdened by thoughts too fragile to survive the scrutiny of others. His fear of failure surfaced first. It did not appear in grand declarations, but in the quiet tremor at the end of a sentence, in the way he repeated his own reasoning as if trying to steady it, in the long pauses meant to hide uncertainty. He confessed these fears in fragments, allowing them to slip out when exhaustion loosened his restraint. The mistress listened without shifting, without tightening her expression or trying to reassure him. Her stillness became the place where fears could exist without shame. A king could not falter in council, but in her presence, the possibility of failure no longer needed to be masked. Suspicion followed closely behind. The Tudor court was a tangle of loyalty and betrayal, each face capable of concealing its true intentions. Advisors who bowed to him by day sent letters by candlelight, forging alliances he could not fully trace. Even family ties carried cracks wide enough for treachery to slip through. He spoke of these suspicions in cautious tones, as though testing whether he dared articulate them. The mistress did not respond, did not speculate, did not echo his doubts. She simply heard them, and that hearing alone made them feel more bearable. Suspicion is easier to endure when someone silently shares the room with it. Then came the thoughts entirely incompatible with the image of a monarch. Frustrations he could not express publicly. Resentments toward the rituals that shaped him since childhood. Ordinary human impulses he was forbidden to acknowledge. The burden of always appearing composed had hardened him. Yet underneath that hardness lived emotions the court would never allow him to express. He spoke of longing for freedom from constant vigilance, of fatigue that bordered on resentment, of wondering whether the throne owned him more than he owned it. These thoughts would have shocked ministers and scandalized the nobility. But the mistress received them without flinching, her quiet gaze neither approving nor condemning. The power of her listening came not from understanding, but from the absence of reaction. Had she shown surprise, he would have withdrawn. Had she shown agreement, he would have questioned her motives. Instead, she offered a space untouched by the expectations that defined the rest of his life. In this space, he could permit himself to be less than the king. He could be uncertain, haunted, or weary without fearing judgment. It was a kind of refuge, and he entered it willingly. Over time, these confessions took on a rhythm. His voice softened when he began speaking of fears. It sharpened when suspicion overtook him. It dropped lower when he touched on the thoughts he considered unfit for a ruler. She learned this rhythm the way one learns a familiar song, not through intention, but through repetition. She did not guide it, she allowed it, and in her silence, he found a sense of recognition that did not truly exist. What makes this dynamic so quietly dangerous is the king's growing belief that she held his truest self. He never questioned whether she wanted this role. He simply assumed her stillness meant acceptance. In reality, she revealed nothing. Her silence did not bind her to him, but it bound him to her. With every secret he placed into the quiet she provided, he wove another thread into the attachment forming between them. These were not secrets of state, they were secrets of identity, the kind that reshaped how he experienced her presence. No counselor, no courtier, no queen could occupy the space she gradually, almost imperceptibly, filled. It was a position created not by seduction but by confession, not by passion but by vulnerability. And the king, blind to the illusion he had built, he stepped more fully into it each time he spoke. In her presence, he allowed himself to imagine a version of life unburdened by performance. That imagination, though false, sustained him. He returned to her again and again, because she had become the silent witness to the parts of himself he could not reveal elsewhere. And once a man entrusts those hidden truths to someone, he cannot help feeling tethered to them. He left these conversations carrying the weight of what he had admitted, unaware that speaking them aloud had pulled him further from the mask he wore. The refuge he believed he had found was shaping itself into a dependency he could not recognize. Soon, the secrets he shares will no longer feel optional. They will feel like something he must bring to her. There comes a point when conversation stops being an exchange and becomes a tether. Something that pulls a man back toward the place where he last allowed himself to unravel. The king did not notice when this shift began. He only realized, quietly and without ceremony, that unfinished thoughts lingered long after he left the mistress's chambers. These fragments returned to him in council meetings, during prayers, even while addressing ambassadors. They drifted through his mind like threads waiting to be tied, and the only place he felt capable of tying them was in her presence. He returned not because he was summoned, but because something in him insisted on completing what he had begun. A conversation that stopped abruptly felt like a door left open. A confession interrupted felt like a breath held too long. The mistress did not remind him of these fragments. She never asked him to continue. But he remembered, and remembering created the pull. He sought her quietly, sometimes earlier than usual, as though the pressure of unspoken thoughts tightened around him until he could no longer ignore it. Each meeting deepened this attachment in ways neither acknowledged aloud. He arrived with a kind of urgency masked beneath composure. His words flowed differently, less guarded, more certain that she would absorb whatever he offered. The rhythm of their conversations grew familiar, almost ritualistic. He would sit, to release a fragment of worry or frustration, then settle into the slow unwinding that followed. The act of speaking became its own relief. The relief became its own hunger. And hunger, once fed too often, does not diminish, it grows. She did not attempt to direct him. She simply received whatever he carried, letting the weight of his words settle between them without reaction. That absence of reaction was precisely what bound him more tightly. A king surrounded by opinions, strategies, warnings, and obligations found in her silence something that felt like necessity. He mistook this need for connection. He did not realize that he had built the illusion himself, thread by thread, confession by confession. Over time, she became the keeper of things he could never speak elsewhere. His doubts, his resentments, his mistrust, his volatile flashes of fear, these were not secrets of state, but secrets of self. The kind that shaped the fragile center beneath the crown. Once spoken, they did not disappear. They took root in her presence, creating a private landscape only he could walk through. And the more he revealed, the more deeply He believed she alone understood the parts of him that the world refused to see. What formed between them was not intimacy in any conventional sense. It was something quieter, heavier, and far more binding. His need to continue each unfinished thought grew into a compulsion. There were days when he carried new burdens directly to her, unable to bear the delay of letting them settle. There were nights when he replayed her silence, imagining how she would receive the words he had not yet spoken. The mistress became the invisible counterpart to every decision he weighed, not through influence, but through the quiet knowledge that she held the pieces he could not reveal elsewhere. It is unsettling how easily dependence disguises itself as routine. A king who returned repeatedly to the same chamber with the same unspoken expectation began to believe the pattern was natural. He did not question why sharing his fears with her eased him. He did not consider what it meant to rely on her presence for clarity. He simply followed the pull of the unfinished and let it lead him back to her again and again. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Courtiers assumed he visited her for the same reasons kings had always visited mistresses. They did not realize the true bond formed not in physical closeness, but in the quiet weight of words entrusted. The most revealing confessions are rarely dramatic. They come softly, as though unsure of their own danger. And once given, they tie the speaker to the listener more effectively than any public vow. The mistress understood this. She did not encourage or provoke. She only allowed the cycle to continue. She knew that becoming the keeper of his private thoughts positioned her in a place no rival could easily challenge. Influence built through desire was fragile. Influence built through confession was far more enduring. She never asked for more. She never needed to. The king brought it to her himself. In the silence between their meetings, his mind returned repeatedly to the things he had told her, and the things he had not yet said. These unspoken remnants tightened around him like a soft, invisible cord. It did not restrain him. It guided him, and he followed willingly. He stepped away from each meeting feeling lighter, never noticing how much weight he placed in her silence. The stories he returned to finish were stitching themselves into a bond he could no longer explain. Somewhere ahead, the secrets he entrusts will begin to shape the choices he believes he makes alone. The distinction between the queen and the mistress did not lie solely in status or ceremony. It lived in the atmosphere surrounding each woman, in the different versions of the king that emerged when he stood before them. The queen carried the weight of expectation, an embodiment of duty, lineage, and political stability. Every gesture she made was interpreted through the lens of responsibility. Her role was public, immovable, and shaped by centuries of tradition. The king entered her presence with the full armor of monarchy, aware that every word spoken between them rippled beyond the private chamber. The mistress, however, occupied an entirely different sphere. Her presence did not demand performance. There were no dynastic pressures woven into her gaze, no diplomatic consequences tied to her silence. She was not the symbol of continuity or the guardian of alliances. Instead, she existed in the margins, the quiet space where the king could step out of the rigid expectations that defined him. She represented privacy, something a ruler rarely possessed. And it was this privacy, more than physical allure, that drew him repeatedly toward her. The queen's role required structure, scheduled meetings, formal ceremonies, and conversations shaped by the obligations of rule. Even moments meant to be personal carried the dull weight of responsibility. She was the anchor of the monarchy, and anchors, by nature, do not drift. Her loyalty was fixed, her presence consistent, her silence, often the silence of endurance rather than understanding. The king respected her, relied on her, and in many ways feared disappointing her. But he did not confide in her. He could not. Her position made honesty dangerous. The mistress had no such constraints. She asked nothing of him beyond the space she allowed him to inhabit. Her quiet did not feel like duty. It felt voluntary. When she listened, it did not carry the hardness of obligation. It softened the edges of his thoughts, letting him speak not as a ruler, but as a man struggling beneath the weight of his own crown. She did not represent the kingdom. She did not carry the expectations of foreign courts. She held only the fragments he chose to give her. These differences were subtle yet profound. With the queen, he guarded himself. With the mistress, he unravelled. With the queen, he performed certainly. With the mistress, he revealed doubt. The contrast created an emotional imbalance neither woman intended. But both existed within. The queen upheld his authority. The mistress absorbed the cost of it. What made this imbalance so striking was that neither role could replace the other. The queen's strength lay in structure, alliances, stability, the lineage she protected. Her presence maintained the kingdom's order. She embodied the public face of monarchy. Calm, steadfast, untouchable. These qualities left little room for the vulnerabilities the king carried quietly. The mistress, by contrast, existed in the realm of the unspoken. She did not strengthen his political standing. She strengthened the illusion that his burdens could be shared, even if only for moments at a time. She offered no solutions, no strategies, no counsel. She offered the quiet acknowledgement of his humanity, something the throne denied him. In her silence, he imagined understanding. In her steadiness, he imagined closeness. In her presence, he imagined escape. It is unsettling how these roles shaped him. The queen reminded him of who he needed to be. The mistress reminded him of who he feared he might be beneath the crown. He relied on both identities to survive the demands of kingship. But the ease he felt in the mistress's company slowly eclipsed the respect he held for his wife. Respect, after all, sustains duty. Ease sustains desire. The court interpreted this contrast simplistically, reducing it to passion versus propriety. They whispered about seduction and favoritism. They did not see the deeper truth. The king was not drawn to the mistress because she challenged the queen, but because she did not challenge him. Each woman served a function shaped by forces far beyond their own intentions. And the king, caught between these worlds, leaned ever more heavily toward the place that required the least from him. In time, the queen's presence felt heavier, her duties more demanding, her silence more rigid. The mistress's presence felt lighter, her quiet more accommodating, her gaze less burdened by expectation. He did not realize that what he perceived as comfort was merely the absence of responsibility. But absence, when paired with vulnerability, becomes powerful. He walked away from these encounters, noticing how differently he breathed in each presence. Though he never questioned why, the divide between duty and comfort was widening, pulling him toward the place where he felt most unguarded. Soon, the weight of these roles will begin shaping choices he believes are his alone to make. Avoiding conflict in the Tudor court required more precision than any public negotiation. Arguments carried consequences and questions, especially the wrong ones, had a way of rearranging alliances. The king lived inside a constant web of tension, where every request was interpreted, every hesitation analyzed, every promise weighed against political cost. In such an environment, the mistress's refusal to demand anything from him carried an unusual power. Her manner of listening created a space untouched by confrontation, a quiet refuge where pressure loosened rather than pressed tighter. She never asked for commitments, not even the small emotional assurances that most lovers sought. She did not inquire about the future, did not press him to define the boundaries of their relationship, did not ask what place she held in his life. Her restraint removed the possibility of disappointment, the friction of unmet expectations. With her, the king did not have to navigate the risks of refusing or delaying. By asking for nothing, she spared him the burden of refusing anything. This absence of demand became its own form of comfort. She also avoided questions that might force him into honesty. Hard questions carried the sharpness of truth, the kind that struck directly at motive. Affection, or fear. The mistress never asked whether he trusted her, whether he loved his queen, or whether he intended to act on the confessions he made in private. She never cornered him with inquiries about loyalty or future promises. Her silence allowed him to drift, unchallenged, through the complexities he avoided elsewhere. The king, relieved not to confront these questions, mistook her restraint for understanding. Their conversations unfolded with an ease that felt rare to him. He spoke as he wished, without worrying what she expected in return. She offered a softness that required nothing from him beyond presence. This lack of confrontation kept their relationship suspended in a state of gentle ambiguity. It was neither declared nor denied, neither fragile nor secure. It existed in the liminal space between meaning and illusion, where neither felt compelled to define it. That ambiguity became part of the appeal. What made this avoidance so effective was that it kept the king from feeling threatened. Conflict, even the smallest kind, reminded him of his responsibilities, his failures, his limits. It pressed against the fragile parts of him that he tried to hide. The mistress avoided such pressure entirely. She never forced him to justify his actions or confront contradictions in his words. She allowed inconsistencies to remain unspoken, letting them drift harmlessly into the background. He left her chambers, believing he had been understood when, in truth, nothing had been addressed. It is unsettling how easily comfort can become dependence. The king began seeking her not for resolution but for the absence of confrontation. When duties demanded too much, he went to her because she demanded nothing. When advisers pressed him with arguments, he went to her because she offered silence. When the queen required accountability, he went to her because she required none. Each visit reinforced the illusion that her quiet was gentleness, not strategy. What neither of them said aloud was that this avoidance protected her as much as it soothed him. Without demanding anything, she never risked losing what little influence she held. Without asking difficult questions, she never forced him into truths that might pull him away. By keeping the relationship undefined, she allowed him to shape it according to his own needs. His comfort became her shield, and her silence became the structure that held their bond in place. The court misinterpreted this dynamic entirely. They believed she manipulated him through softness, unaware that her true advantage lay in absence. Absence of pressure, absence of expectation, absence of conflict. Kings were accustomed to demands. They were not accustomed to spaces free of them. The rarity of such a space made it precious. Over time, he returned to her chambers with increasing familiarity. He sank into the quiet without recognizing how deeply he relied on it. The lack of conflict created not peace, but habit, a pattern of turning to her whenever the world pressed too hard. He felt safe in the ease she offered, unaware that avoidance, when repeated often enough, becomes a kind of tether. He left her presence, believing she soothed him, not realizing she simply removed the weight others forced him to carry. The ease he found in her quiet was beginning to anchor itself into his routines. In the days ahead, what he avoids elsewhere will draw him back to her with a pull he cannot ignore. The king's transformation did not begin with a sudden realization. It unfolded slowly, through a series of conversations that slipped further from restraint each time he entered her chamber. He began speaking of his emotions with a looseness that had not been present before. Hesitations replaced by elaboration. Fragments replaced by confessions. What started as the occasional admission turned into a steady stream. He no longer described events. He described how those events made him feel, layering meaning onto his own reactions, as though he were discovering himself for the first time. In the quiet she offered, he found space to expand his emotions without interruption. Each time, she did not contradict him. His voice gained confidence. Each time, she did not question him. His interpretations grew bolder. He mistook the absence of resistance for validation. His feelings no longer seemed fleeting. They seemed justified, important, worthy of attention. And the more he spoke, the more he convinced himself that the emotional clarity he experienced in her presence belonged to something deeper than circumstance. Gradually, he began attributing this clarity to her. He believed her presence steadied him, that her attention sharpened the truths he carried. He imagined intention where there was only silence, imagined understanding where there was only restraint. His mind, hungry for connection, filled the space she left empty. He interpreted her quiet as encouragement, her stillness as closeness, her patience as proof that she cared for him in ways no one else dared. He did not realize the meaning came from within him, not from her. He started speaking of her indirectly, how her listening eased him, how her quiet felt different from the court's formality, how returning to her made the weight of rule more bearable. These statements slipped out before he noticed them, shaped by the comfort he had woven into their interactions. By the time he realized how often her name lingered in his thoughts, the pattern had already settled into habit. He no longer sought her merely for relief. He sought her because he believed she played a role in his sense of self. What made this evolution haunting was how easily he convinced himself that his growing attachment was mutual. He projected intention onto her gestures, the tilt of her head, the softness of her gaze, the calm in her movements. He read affection in places where she offered only neutrality. He read devotion in the constancy of her presence. The quiet he once interpreted as safety became proof, in his mind, that she held feelings she never voiced. He did not question whether this was true. He simply accepted it because the alternative, that he was alone with his longing, was too difficult to bear. Over time, he formed conclusions as though they had been whispered to him. He believed she understood him more deeply than anyone else. He believed her silence meant she shared his emotional terrain. He believed her presence carried significance beyond circumstance. And once he believed these things, desire formed naturally, quietly, almost logically. His reasoning led him to it. The more he spoke, the more he shaped the narrative that surrounded them. He did not see that he was the one writing it. The court, of course, saw only the outcome. They noticed how his attention drifted toward her in gatherings, how his tone softened when she passed, how he defended her without hesitation. They assumed seduction. They missed the truth. The king had seduced himself. It was his own interpretations, not her actions, that guided him. Self-persuasion is often stronger than influence, and he followed the path his mind laid out with unwavering certainty. The queen sensed the shift most clearly. She saw how the king's emotions, once contained and measured, spilled more freely. She recognized how his gaze sharpened when the mistress entered a room, how he lingered in silence after speaking with her. But even she could not unravel the depth of the internal logic he had built. The mistress was not merely a woman to him. She had become the answer to the emotional questions he could not ask anywhere else. By the time the king finally named his longing, though only to himself, it felt undeniable. His reasoning had taken him there, step by step, each conclusion guiding the next. He believed her attention had grown into affection. He believed his confessions had created a bond, and he believed the tenderness he felt was reciprocated, even when she expressed nothing. Desire, in his mind, was simply the natural endpoint of understanding. He did not realize that the understanding existed only within him. He walked away from their conversations, convinced that clarity had brought him to truth, never noticing how much of that truth he had shaped alone. The meanings he assigned her silence were beginning to solidify into certainty. Ahead of him, the conclusions he carries will start to govern the choices he cannot yet see. A peculiar quiet surrounded the mistress's influence, so subtle that even the king failed to recognize its shape. She never pushed him, never guided him toward declarations, never hinted at expectations that might corner or embarrass him. Instead, she allowed space for him to arrive at conclusions she never voiced, space for desire to take root without encouragement, space for the boundaries he crossed to feel self-chosen rather than shaped by another hand. This restraint gave her more power than insistence ever could. The king, accustomed to people pressing for favors or positions, felt disarmed by her lack of ambition. She did not ask him to make promises. She did not request titles, lands, or symbols of favor. She did not attempt to secure her place in ways that the court expected. Her absence of demands made each step he took feel entirely his own. When he lingered in her chambers, he told himself it was because he wanted to, because nothing pulled him there except longing. This illusion preserved his pride while deepening his attachment. Her silence created a doorway rather than a path. He chose when to cross it, how far to go, and what meaning to attach to every glance and pause. She left the door unguarded, never turning away, never beckoning him closer. The simplicity of that availability worked on him slowly. A king who lived surrounded by resistance found irresistible the idea of a space where nothing opposed him, and so he drifted toward her without ever feeling pushed. Her restraint also protected her. Had she shown eagerness, he might have pulled back out of suspicion. Had she requested public acknowledgement, he would have recoiled from the political consequences. But by remaining steady and unobtrusive, she avoided every pitfall that destroyed mistresses before her. She let the king's imagination fill the quiet, his interpretation, his meaning, his desire. In his mind, she became the woman who understood him, not because she acted, but because she did not. As the days passed, he interpreted her stillness as permission. He spoke more openly, stood closer than necessary, and allowed his hand to linger near hers. He convinced himself she welcomed these shifts, even though she offered no verbal confirmation. The power of self-persuasion is strongest in the absence of contradiction. She simply did nothing to interrupt the unfolding of his thoughts. By not pushing him forward, she allowed him to believe the movement was entirely his. He grew increasingly aware of his desire, though he rarely named it aloud. It lived in the moments he imagined her presence during long council hours, in the way he sought her gaze across crowded chambers, in the quiet ache he felt when duty forced him elsewhere. These impulses, left unchecked, shaped the story forming in his mind, and because she never tried to steer him away from that story, he walked deeper into it without hesitation. The court noticed his drift, but they misread its origin. They believed she tempted him deliberately, that she wove seduction through glances and whispered assurances. They did not understand that the strongest pull is often created not by pursuit, but by stillness. A king, surrounded by forceful opinions and relentless expectations, stepped toward the one person who asked nothing of him. He interpreted this absence as purity, as sincerity, as emotional truth. He never saw how his longing grew from the meanings he assigned, not from the actions she took. Her restraint also shaped how he justified his desire. Because she did not demand anything, he felt safe wanting her. Because she did not chase him, he believed the longing was mutual. Because she did not speak of love, he convinced himself that love existed naturally. Every step he took felt self-directed, which made each step feel inevitable. A man is far more likely to cross a line when he believes the choice is entirely his own. What made this all the more haunting was how natural it appeared from a distance. No dramatic gestures, no clandestine signals, no visible seduction. Merely a woman who listened, and a king who listened to himself more than to her. She offered a doorway, nothing more. But he, unable to resist the comfort on the other side, convinced himself that the room he entered belonged to both of them. And once he stepped through that quiet doorway, the desire he carried no longer felt like an impulse, it felt like destiny. He left her presence, certain that his longing had grown from truth, never recognizing how much of it came from the silence she allowed. The ease of choosing his own path was beginning to disguise how deeply he was already committed. Beyond this point, the threshold he crossed so freely will begin shaping consequences he has not yet imagined. Listening, in the Tudor court, carried dangers far greater than speaking. Words could be denied, twisted, forgotten, but silence, especially the kind that invited confession, left traces far more difficult to escape. The mistress had no official power, no formal authority, no recognized position beyond the fragile privilege of proximity. Yet proximity alone could turn her into a threat. The more the king confided in her, the more others began to see what he could not, that knowledge is a currency as dangerous as ambition. At first, the risks were invisible. She appeared harmless, a quiet presence in a world sharpened by politics and suspicion. But the court watched carefully. They noticed how long the king remained in her chambers. They noticed the difference in his demeanor when he emerged. They noticed how certain decisions, once debated fiercely, now seemed softened, as though shaped by private reflection rather than public counsel. While she spoke almost nothing, the silence surrounding her began to look suspicious. Those closest to the king worried that she understood too much, not in the sense of possessing secrets of state. Those were guarded well, but in the sense of understanding him, his fears, his doubts, his resentments. These fragments, spoken in quiet moments, were enough to give someone leverage. And leverage, in a court built on fragile loyalties, was indistinguishable from danger, even if she never intended to use what she knew. Others feared the possibility. Her role as listener placed her at the center of an invisible tension. If the king trusted her too deeply, ministers wondered whether she influenced him. If he trusted her too little, they wondered why he returned to her so often. The mere idea that she held thoughts he did not share with them was enough to spark unease. A woman with no title should not have access to the king's unguarded self. In their eyes, intimacy of the mind was a threat far greater than intimacy of the body. Rumors grew quietly, whispered behind heavy doors. Some claimed she manipulated him through sympathy. Others insisted she collected confessions deliberately, storing them like weapons for a moment of opportunity. None of these accusations was true. Yet truth never mattered in a court where perception shaped survival. She had committed no offense beyond listening, but listening alone positioned her where rivals could justify their suspicion. And suspicion, once alive, rarely died. Political danger crept closer as the king's dependence deepened. Those who wished to control him found her presence inconvenient. Those who wished to dethrone him found her presence useful as a scapegoat. In every scenario, she bore the risk. The more he trusted her, the more vulnerable she became. A single misplaced assumption, a single overheard whisper, could transform her from confidant into target. The court did not need proof to destroy her, merely the belief that she mattered. Even the king's affection carried its own shadow. His emotional closeness, built from countless confessions, bound him to her in ways he did not fully understand. But closeness made her visible. Visibility in a royal court brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought danger. Every time he revealed another piece of himself, she felt the weight of what she carried. Words spoken in vulnerability could someday be interpreted as influence, even imagined, could justify punishment. She understood this risk more clearly than he did. The quiet he found comforting was the same quiet that trapped her. She could not refuse his confessions without insulting him. She could not encourage them without appearing ambitious. She walked a line so narrow that even a breath in the wrong direction could shatter her position. In listening, she gained access to the king's heart, but in doing so, she lost the safety of insignificance. The intimacy that formed between them came at a cost. Not a cost he paid, but one she bore alone. Emotional closeness in a world ruled by suspicion was never gentle. It was a blade wrapped in silk. The king believed her silence protected him. He never realized how much it endangered her. To him, she was a refuge. To the court, she was a threat. To herself, she became something she never intended to be, the keeper of truths that could unmake her. He left each conversation lighter, unaware of the risk he placed on the woman who held his unspoken thoughts. The closeness he felt was beginning to cast a shadow that others could not ignore. In the turning days ahead, the vulnerability he shared will become the very weapon his enemies hope to use. Misinterpretation often enters quietly, slipping into the spaces where certainty grows too comfortably. The king had long mistaken the mistress's silence for understanding, her patience for loyalty, her stillness for agreement. But over time, the meaning he assigned to her listening expanded beyond what she could ever sustain. What he once treated as refuge slowly hardened into expectation. He believed she stood on his side simply because she did not contradict him. He believed her neutrality signaled allegiance. In his mind, listening had transformed into a vow she never made. This shift revealed itself in subtle ways. He began speaking to her as though she shared his judgments, his suspicions, even his frustrations. When he confided in his weaknesses, he assumed she held them as her own concerns. When he voiced resentment, he assumed she accepted his grievances. The quiet she maintained, once a source of comfort, became the foundation he used to imagine unity. He no longer distinguished between what he told her and what he believed she felt. Such expectation carried weight. The king started relying on her presence to affirm decisions she had never supported, to soothe emotions she had never invited, to uphold a closeness she had never claimed. He arrived with assumptions rather than revelations, convinced that she would respond in ways she had never promised. Her silence, which once protected her, now risked becoming a confirmation she could not control. The imbalance deepened as his expectations grew. He began seeking reactions, however small, to reinforce the narrative he constructed. A lowered gaze, a softened breath, a still hand. He interpreted these unintended gestures as agreement, as proof that she shared his inner landscape. And when she did not respond as he hoped, when her silence held no warmth, when her posture remained neutral, he felt a quiet disappointment, one she could neither anticipate nor prevent. He also assumed a level of emotional reciprocity she did not possess. Because he confided in her, he believed she carried a comparable dependence. Because he felt drawn to her, he believed she felt drawn to him. This belief made him more vulnerable, but it also made him more demanding. Without speaking the words aloud, he began expecting her to reflect his emotions to him, to mirror the attachment he had formed. These expectations were invisible but heavy, pressing against the fragile boundaries she had carefully maintained. The mistress sensed the shift with a quiet unease. She realized that the balance they once held had begun to tilt. His words were no longer shaped by need alone. They now carried assumptions about her role in his life. He had crossed an internal line she never marked for him, stepping into territory where his longing intertwined with entitlement. This transformation was not violent or sudden. It moved with the slow, unsettling certainty of something inevitable. The danger grew because the imbalance rarely remains private. A king who believes someone supports him begins making decisions as though that support is guaranteed. He defends her before the court with unnecessary fervor. He dismisses concerns others raise about her influence. He reacts with irritation if she appears distant or reserved. Believing her withdrawal reflects betrayal rather than protection. His interpretation of her silence becomes a political liability, a misunderstanding with consequences far beyond emotion. Those around him noticed first. They saw how he looked to her for confirmation she never gave. They saw how he protected her reputation with a sharpness that exceeded reason. They saw how she seemed increasingly uneasy, careful with her posture and her gaze, as though trying to step back from a place she had not chosen. To the court, this imbalance appeared dangerous. To the mistress, it felt suffocating. The more the king misread her silence, the more precarious her position became. If she corrected him, she risked his humiliation. If she remained neutral, she fed his illusion. If she withdrew, the court would assume guilt. And if she stayed, he would continue shaping expectations she could not fulfill. Listening had once shielded her. Now it threatened to entangle her in a narrative she could not control. The king, unaware of the damage unfolding, believed everything remained stable. In truth, the balance between them was already fracturing. His expectations had grown larger than the quiet space she offered. His desire had begun rewriting the meaning of their conversations. His emotions, once softly spoken, now carried the unspoken assumption that she shared them. He stepped away each time, believing they moved in quiet harmony, unaware of how much strain his expectations placed upon her stillness. The silence he cherished was beginning to warp beneath the weight of meanings she had never given. In the hours ahead, the imbalance tightening between them will press against the fragile trust he thinks cannot break. Distance, when maintained carefully, becomes a form of quiet survival. The mistress learned early that listening did not mean revealing, and understanding did not mean offering herself in return. While the king spoke openly, emptied the strain of court and crown, she kept her own story folded tightly, holding each corner with deliberate restraint. To reveal too much would shift the balance. It would encourage him to see her as an equal participant rather than a listening vessel. And equality, in a Tudor court, was far more dangerous than silence. She understood the fragile nature of her position. The moment the king believed she relied on him emotionally, his expectations would multiply. The moment he sensed a reflection of his own vulnerability, he would claim her as something more than she intended to be. So she withheld pieces of herself with the same precision she used to offer attention. A controlled breath, an incomplete smile, a glance that lingered only as long as necessary. These became her tools, signs of presence, but never intimacy. She rarely spoke about her own fears, her own disappointments, her own history. The court was a place where personal stories could be twisted into weapons. And the king, despite his trust, was still a man shaped by power. If she allowed their roles to blur, if she let him comfort her rather than the other way around, she risked shifting the dynamic into territory where affection mixed with responsibility. Once the king felt responsible for her, he would treat her differently, question her motives, or expect emotional loyalty in return. The danger lay in reciprocity. To give him her burdens meant inviting him into her inner world, a place she could not safely share. A mistress had no legal protection, no guaranteed future, no shield against the envy or suspicion of others. Her only defense was control over her voice, her gestures, her silence. She offered him a listening ear, never a vulnerable heart. Every withheld detail protected the fragile boundary standing between comfort and entanglement. Maintaining this distance required discipline. When he asked gentle questions, she answered with fragments. When he tried to turn the moment toward her, she redirected with a quiet nod or a soft comment that returned focus to him. She avoided revealing opinions that might place her on one side of a dispute. She avoided expressing longing that might suggest attachment. She avoided confessions that could one day be used to accuse her of manipulation. In a world where words could determine survival, restraint became her safest language. Even her posture carried intention. She leaned in just enough to show attention, but not enough to imply shared intimacy. Her hands rested still, avoiding gestures that might appear comforting. Her gaze met his only briefly, before softening into neutrality. Every movement signaled presence without possession. She allowed connection to form only in the space where distance could still be maintained. The court misread her quiet, but she did not. Some believed she lacked emotion. Others thought she hid ambition. A few suspected she held secrets dangerous enough to keep her powerful men attentive. They were wrong in one sense and right in another. She did hold secrets, but they were her own, not the court's. She guarded them because they protected her from being absorbed into the king's emotional gravity. The king, unaccustomed to such boundaries, often mistook her distance for gentle mystery. He found it calming that she did not demand answers from him. He found it soothing that she never pressed him for promises. But what he perceived as grace was, in truth, her shield. She had learned that closeness could shift without warning into danger, that affection could turn into possession, that a king's disappointment could ruin a life more swiftly than his affection could save it. Her restraint created a controlled imbalance. The king felt free to speak, confess, unravel, but she remained intact, untouched by the vulnerability he believed they shared. She walked a narrow path where one misplaced word could draw her too close or push her too far. Both extremes brought risk. Only the center, quiet, attentive, distant, kept her safe. In the quiet, after each conversation, she exhaled slowly, aware of how much effort it took to hold herself separate. Distance was not coldness. It was a strategy. It was the thin veil that allowed her to remain in his presence without losing herself to it. And as the days passed, she understood this balance was never permanent. A single misstep could expose more than she intended. A single moment of softness could shift everything. He stepped away, believing the quiet steadiness she offered was effortless, unaware of how much she concealed to keep her place intact. The distance she maintained was beginning to shape the way he reached for her. Across the coming moments, that fragile boundary will shift in a way neither of them can fully control. He did not notice when her silence began to stretch between his sentences. It settled quietly in the room, soft enough to feel harmless, yet deliberate enough to leave him waiting for what she might say next. She knew that every withheld word changed the rhythm of their conversations, creating a small ache that grew each time he looked for a reply she would not give. Her stillness was never cold, it was measured, calm, and shaped to make him lean toward her without realizing he was doing so. The court expected women to speak little, but she had turned that expectation into a shield, something she could tighten or loosen depending on who was watching and how close danger stood. There were evenings when he spoke freely, filling the silence she offered with stories, confessions, and scattered thoughts he would never say at council. She listened, the same quiet posture, the same controlled breathing, but she allowed small pauses to linger after his words. Those pauses unsettled him in a way he did not fully understand. It was not rejection, it was absence. An absence that made him crave her presence even more. She saw the shift each time his voice softened. Each time his eyes searched her expression, hoping for a reaction she chose not to give. In the palace, silence was rarely safe. A wrong moment of hesitation could be read as defiance. A poorly timed quietness as conspiracy. Yet she managed to use silence without appearing withdrawn. She left just enough space for him to fill, guiding the conversation by stepping aside rather than stepping forward. If she had spoken more, she might have revealed too much, or promised something she could not offer. If she had spoken less, she risked losing his attention. She found the narrow middle path, and she walked it with the caution of someone who understood how quickly a king's affection could turn into suspicion. There were days when the strain of that quiet performance settled in her shoulders. Listening was tiring. Being silent at the right time was even heavier. She could never allow frustration to appear. Never show what she truly thought about the stories he unfolded. Her silence had to feel inviting. Not distant. Steady. Not empty. It required control that left her exhausted long after he returned to his chambers. Yet she maintained it, because silence kept her safe in ways words never could. What he perceived as gentleness was, to her, a form of survival. She could not correct him, could not contradict him, could not reveal the boundaries she guarded so carefully. Silence kept her from becoming too important or too dangerous in the eyes of those who monitored every shift in the king's attention. Silence allowed her to disappear when needed, reappear when useful, and move quietly through a world where both affection and envy could ruin her with frightening speed. She had learned that the safest place for a mistress was not in a king's heart, but somewhere just outside its center, close enough to be wanted, far enough not to be blamed. At times, he mistook her silence for comfort, believing she withheld comments out of care rather than strategy. That misunderstanding protected her more than any spoken reassurance ever could. Each pause he experienced as tenderness was, in truth, a carefully measured space she created to keep herself stable. She needed him to desire her presence, but she also needed room to breathe, to think, to watch without being drawn too tightly into his private storms. Silence was the only tool that allowed her to achieve both at once. As he grew accustomed to the sensation of being quietly received, he returned to her more frequently. The court believed her influence was rising, but she knew better. Influence required words, and words risked consequences. She relied instead on the soft weight of quiet moments, knowing that the less she said, the more he imagined. That imagination was safer than any truth she might speak aloud. In those long, unbroken pauses, she found a rare kind of protection, one that came not from power, but from restraint. And yet, beneath the calm surface, she understood something else as well. Silence could not hold forever. There would come a moment when someone noticed how tightly he clung to the comfort she offered. A moment when her presence would be questioned, analyzed, or embedded. For now, silence kept her steady. For now, it kept her safe. But every unspoken word carries weight. And eventually, even the quietest survival strategy leaves a trace. He left believing her stillness was devotion, unaware of how deeply it shaped his return. Her quiet restraint was beginning to weave itself into his habits without resistance. Before the palace fully notices, her silence will press against dangers she can no longer slip past. He returned to her chambers without thinking, as if the path had been carved into the floor by his own footsteps. What began as occasional visits after difficult counsels had become something quieter, steadier, almost unconscious. He no longer questioned why he sought her. He simply moved toward the only place where his thoughts felt lighter. She saw the shift not through grand gestures, but in the small ways he hesitated at her door. The way his breath eased the moment she looked up. Habit had taken root, settling between them with a weight neither fully acknowledged. Her silence no longer surprised him. Instead, he grew uneasy when it was absent. If she spoke too quickly, he noticed. If her expression was not as he remembered, something in him tightened. He had become accustomed to the soft rhythm she created, the unbroken listening that smoothed the sharp edges of his day. In council, he carried himself with the rigid certainty expected of a king. In her presence, he allowed the posture to fall away. It was not love, not yet, but it was something that slipped close to dependence. She felt that dependence before he recognized it. His stories grew longer, his pauses shorter. When she shifted even slightly in her chair, he read the movement as meaning. When she looked away, his voice faltered. She learned that the smallest gestures could steady him or unsettle him, and the realization left a cold heaviness along her ribs. A king's reliance was not a gift, it was a tether, one she had no choice but to hold with careful hands. Too much warmth, and he might mistake it for devotion. Too little, and he might turn to someone else, or wonder why she no longer soothed him. His expectations changed quietly. He no longer asked whether she had time to listen, he assumed she did. He no longer thanked her for her attention. He believed it was part of her nature. Each step brought him closer. Not in affection, but in certainty. A certainty that her steadiness belonged to him, that her silence existed for his comfort. The court did not see this shift, but she did, and the knowledge forced her to measure every breath she released in his presence. When she was absent, when illness, fatigue, or simple caution kept her away, his restlessness spread through the palace like smoke slipping under doors. He became short-tempered with council members, distracted during prayers, and impatient with servants who failed to anticipate his needs. It was not anger, it was discomfort, a hollow feeling he could not admit aloud. He had grown used to speaking into the quiet space she offered, and without it, his thoughts turned heavy and uncooperative. A king who governed nations could not bear a single evening without being heard. She sensed the danger in that shift. Habit was safe when it was shared. It became perilous when it deepened on only one side. His reliance made her more visible, more talked about, more vulnerable to the whispers that flourished in every hallway. She knew the thin line between comforting a king and being named a distraction, a manipulator, or a threat. Yet she also knew she could not retreat too far. His familiarity demanded her presence as steadily as hunger demands bread. He began to speak in the language of return. Phrases like, "As I told you before," or "You remember what I meant," spoken as if she were the keeper of his thoughts rather than the witness. That imagining, once small, was beginning to swell. He believed she understood him more deeply than anyone else, though she had offered him nothing except attention shaped to look like care. She felt the weight of that misunderstanding settle against her shoulders, a reminder that listening carried consequences long after the words faded. What unsettled her most was the way his presence shifted when he looked at her. The gaze held something quieter than desire, more persistent than affection, something that belonged to the rhythm of a man reaching instinctively for what soothed him. She knew that once a king grows accustomed to a comfort, removing it becomes dangerous. The sweetness of being needed had turned to something sharp, something she had to manage without letting him see the strain in her breath. She did not speak of these fears. Instead, she kept her posture calm, her breath steady, her silence warm enough to seem effortless. But inside, she understood the truth. His habit had become her burden, and his comfort had become the thread tightening slowly around her life. What held him to her was no longer curiosity or charm. It was a craving that deepened each time he walked through her door. He leaned toward her presence now, as naturally as breathing, never seeing the sharp edges hidden beneath the comfort he felt. Her quiet steadiness was already binding him more tightly than he realized. Across the quiet days that follow, this growing pull will force her to choose between safety and the very silence that once protected her. The chronicles like to begin with the voice of a king. They describe the firmness of command, the weight of speeches delivered before council, the declarations that changed the shape of kingdoms. They remember the words that thundered through great halls or drifted softly across royal gardens. Yet, behind those recorded sentences lived another presence. Quiet, steady, and almost entirely erased. A listener sat in the dimmer corners of power, receiving the private fragments that never reached any parchment. The world remembered what he said. The world forgot who made it possible for him to say it at all. Inside her chambers, the atmosphere remained constant, a slow-burning candle, a chair placed just close enough to suggest safety, but far enough to avoid presumption. A silence that waited without demanding. Into that stillness, the unspoken weight of a king's life settled. The listener absorbed the pieces that slipped from him. Pieces he would never reveal before the court. Pieces shaped by fear, ambition, exhaustion, or doubt. Her presence did not intrude. It simply held. And because it held, the king returned again and again, mistaking the relief of release for something resembling affection. The kingdom never saw the transformation that occurred in those private hours. A ruler who appeared composed before the nation became almost fragile in the narrow space between her door and his confession. This contrast was stark, but only she witnessed it. The palace, with all its eyes and ears, somehow never noticed the subtle way his shoulders lowered when he entered, or the way his speech softened. These small changes were invisible to everyone, except the woman who had learned to stay still enough to notice them. For the listener, the intimacy of listening came with a sharp, constant tension. Each confession he offered increased the weight she carried. The words were never meant for her safety. They were meant for his relief. Yet the more he depended on her silence, the more carefully she had to guard her own movements. A single misplaced reaction could shift his understanding of her role. If she responded too warmly, he might read devotion where none existed. If she responded too coolly, he might feel abandoned. Balance became her most necessary skill, an art she practiced with every measured breath. The palace seemed unaware of how much of the king's emotional world rested on someone invisible. Officials spoke confidently about influencing him. Counselors boasted of guiding his judgment, and courtiers imagined they understood his temperament. None of them knew that the true core of his steadiness lay in a room lit by a single candle, where a woman listened as he disclosed everything he could not express elsewhere. They judged the outcomes without understanding the process, completely oblivious to the private exchanges that shaped the public man. For her, the danger of being indispensable was always present. There was power in hearing the secrets of a king, but it was a power that threatened as much as it protected. Should suspicion arise, should a rival whisper the right rumor, she could be accused of controlling what she merely witnessed. Women in her position rarely chose influence. Influence chose them, not through ambition but through proximity. And history punished those who held any form of unspoken authority, whether they sought it or not. In rare moments of quiet reflection, she wondered how many other women across centuries had occupied this same invisible position. Someone must have listened to the confessions of rulers before him. Someone whose name dissolved into time because her role left no trace, considered worthy of preservation. The stories of empires often centered on speeches, decrees, and victories, but never on the individuals who caught the raw, unpolished fears behind those triumphs. These listeners formed a lineage of forgotten witnesses, each one erased, while the men they steadied were exalted. She never asked for gratitude, but the lack of acknowledgement sometimes settled in her chest like a cold stone. He left each evening lighter, calmer, more certain of his place in the world. She remained behind, carrying the residue of his confessions, knowing none of it would belong to any written account. His burdens evaporated as he walked away. Hers lingered long after the echoes of his voice faded from the room. Even so, she continued to listen, not for affection, not for favor, but because listening was the only safe path available to her. Speaking was dangerous, revealing her own thoughts even more so. Silence became both her armor and her cage. Within that silence, she learned to read the king more clearly than he understood himself. She could sense when he arrived, burdened with a new worry, when he tried to mask confusion behind sternness, when he searched for validation without knowing he sought it. Her ability to interpret him became stronger than any bond built on romance. Yet it was a connection that offered no protection, no recognition, no future. The more he returned, the deeper his reliance grew. Habit became expectation, and expectation became something perilously close to emotional claim. He believed she understood him fully, though she had revealed almost nothing of herself. He imagined closeness where only caution lived, and in that confusion, desire began to form, not from passion, but from the illusion of being truly known. She saw this clearly, even if he did not. The desire he felt was born from the comfort of confession, from the rare experience of being heard without judgment. That misunderstanding placed her in a dangerous position, the object of a yearning she never intended to inspire, a yearning that could turn volatile if denied. History had shown again and again that men in power rarely accepted emotional boundaries with grace. The palace would one day remember him for the decisions he made, the alliances he forged, the wars he waged or avoided. His name would survive in ink and stone, but the quiet woman who steadied his thoughts in the vulnerable hours would vanish without mention. Her role would dissolve, as countless roles like hers had, into the soft darkness of forgotten labor, essential, intimate, and unrecorded. She understood this destiny. She accepted it. But acceptance did not erase the truth she carried. Many of the king's choices were shaped not by counsel or scripture, but by the quiet hours he spent unraveling himself in her presence. His clarity came from the silence she provided. His resolve came from the emotional space she protected. His desire, though misdirected, began in the warmth of being understood. History would never speak her name, but the threads of influence she held, woven so delicately into the private moments of a king's life, would remain unseen, uncredited, but undeniably real. The world may celebrate the voice that shaped a kingdom, but the weight behind that voice was eased in a quiet room no one bothered to record. The memory of her presence fades even as the echo of his stories grows louder. And long after the chronicles close, the truth of who steadied him will drift in silence, waiting for someone willing to look past the legend. Thank you for listening tonight. May your rest be gentle. May your thoughts settle softly, and may the quiet around you feel like shelter, not burden. Good night.